Okay, welcome everybody to the webinar here at BINA. Today's topic is about getting a tattoo. So, it sounds a little random, but in the connection to right now is that in this week's Parsha, in this week's Torah portion, it says the following. Bonim atem la Hashem elekeichem. You are children to Hashem, your God. Which means, do not cut your flesh or do not make a bald spot for a dead body. That's translated very literally. Now the simple meaning of that verse is that a person shouldn't cut themselves or tear out their hair out of mourning over a dead person. In the olden times, in the times before this commandment was given, the common custom in the world was that when you lost a loved one, when you were in grief, you would express that grief by actually cutting your flesh or tearing out hair, and that would be some sort of expression of grief. However, Torah, although obviously it acknowledges the feeling of grief and the feeling of mourning, and therefore there are so many laws regarding how a person should mourn, how long a person should mourn, where, etc., all those type of things. But at the end of the day, it can't get out of hand. It can't be endless grief without any hope. A person does eventually need to be consoled, at least partially. And therefore, the concept of cutting oneself and ripping out one's hair out of grief is sort of a sign of just inconsolable grief. And that's something that Torah doesn't like, and therefore forbids us to cut our flesh and tear out our hair in mourning. However, in this verse is also included the general idea, the general prohibition against cutting oneself, and that includes tattoos. It says it more explicitly somewhere else in the Torah, in Chumash Vayikra, where it says, "Ksoives kaka loititnu bachem," which means, literally, sunken writing don't put in yourself. Meaning a writing which is sunken in the skin, i.e. a tattoo. Now, before we get into perspective and reasons why we can't get tattoos and things like that, first let's get into more the technical side of this. What exactly is forbidden, to who is it forbidden, and when is it forbidden? According to most opinions, the Torah prohibition, it means the biblical prohibition against getting a tattoo, in order to transgress that prohibition, you have to do two things. You need to pierce the skin, actually cut the skin, and fill that cut with ink. In other words, in order for it to be considered permanent writing on the body, these two things have to take place. The skin needs to be pierced, and ink needs to fill that skin. It can be done in either order. Either order you do it, you have transgressed the commandment against getting a tattoo. Now, even if in theory that could get erased, it's still rabbinically prohibited to etch ink in one's skin. How about etching, cutting the skin and making some sort of mark without ink? That seems to be a rabbinic prohibition. It doesn't mean it's less important, but it means that it's not biblical, it's from the sages. Now, what is forbidden? What type of tattoo is forbidden? So, according to some opinions, anything, any shapes, any signs, any letters, anything is prohibited, even biblically. According to other opinions, biblically speaking, it's only if you tattoo words or letters or a figure of something. However, if you just do a random shape which is meaningless, you wouldn't transgress that prohibition. However, according to everybody, rabbinically speaking, it would be prohibited to do any type of tattoo, whatever the shape, whatever the size, whatever it is. The exception that is given in Shulchan Aruch is a very interesting exception, and that is if it's medically needed. And the case which is brought there, we probably don't use this process anymore, but it seems like in the old days, in order to heal a wound, they would fill it up with some sort of ash, and that ash might be colored. So you have a wound, which happened to you by mistake, it happened, and you want to address that wound with some sort of ash, and what will happen is the color from that ash will actually remain in the skin. So the Shulchan Aruch says, since it's medically needed, and besides for the color of the ash, there will always be some sort of scab, some sort of remains of that wound. Therefore, anybody who sees it will know that it wasn't for a tattoo, it was done for medical purpose. An interesting discussion is whose sin is this exactly? Meaning, if I'm sitting in a chair not moving, and I ask somebody to give me a tattoo, am I transgressing that prohibition? I'm not really doing anything, someone's doing it to me. So there are other examples of such a thing, such as shaving, certain types of shaving, which is prohibited according to the Torah. Who exactly should get the punishment? It's not really relevant practically, because practically we're not allowed to do it. Whether I'm the one who's considered liable or the one who's giving it to me is considered liable, but it's just an interesting discussion. And it seems like if I just sit still and don't do anything, don't help him in any way, shape, or form, then it might not be considered regarding punishment, so to speak, my sin. It might be considered the one who's giving it to me, his sin. But if I help them in any way, shape, or form, I would be part of that act. But either way, as I said, it's a wrong thing to do. Now, how about a case, and this is a very interesting case. If somebody got a tattoo already, let's say the case was they didn't know it was prohibited. They weren't religious, they didn't realize, they didn't know Torah law, and they didn't realize there was anything wrong with it. And obviously, before I go on, obviously that person is not to blame. We have a concept in Torah called a tinok shenishpa, somebody who grew up in an atmosphere which wasn't filled with Jewish values. They never had the opportunity to learn for no fault of their own. And this happened and they got a tattoo. And then they decide to come closer to Judaism and adopt a Jewish way of life. What should they do with that tattoo? It's a fascinating discussion. Should they try to remove it, even though it's very painful? So, first of all, it seems like there's no obligation to remove it, because there's no sin of having a tattoo. The sin is more putting it in there. Once it's there's nothing really one can do. And since when they put it in there, they didn't know, so that's not really considered a sin at all. It was by accident. And now there's no real point, there's no real commandment, I should say, to remove it. However, let's say they want to remove it for whatever reason. There it can actually get complicated because certain methods of removing it can actually be considered getting a tattoo or transgressing a different prohibition. So there are various methods of removing a tattoo. There's some sort of, apparently, I'm not so well versed in this, but apparently there's some sort of cream that may lighten the color. That won't be an issue. Laser surgery probably won't be an issue. However, when you're talking about plastic surgery and things like that, that could actually be problematic because that's causing an unnecessary wound to oneself. There's another method that actually injects another sort of ink into it, which sort of erases the color, and that can be a serious issue because that can actually be considered getting a tattoo, although the intention is to remove the tattoo, but that action itself could be considered getting a tattoo. And very fascinating exception to all of this, and this should be obvious, but it's interesting that it's brought in a responsa of a halachic authority by the name of Rabbi Ephraim Oshri. And the case that's brought over there is that a woman asked him if she should get the tattoo which she got in the camps in the Holocaust, obviously with no fault of her own and no one's holding her liable to that, but should she get it removed? And he answered her that no, on the contrary, she shouldn't get it removed, and the people that have that should wear it as a badge of honor, having survived such a terrible thing. There's a famous saying from the Satmarov that someone once came to ask him a blessing, and he said that if you want your blessing to be fulfilled, go and find the first person who has a number tattooed on their arm, and whether they're religious, not religious, makes absolutely no difference. They're holy people, and you should ask them for a blessing because their blessing has special power. So obviously, that's a unique exception to all of this. But in generally speaking, to go and voluntarily get a tattoo is a Torah prohibition. Writing on oneself in a way which is not permanent at all may not be recommended, but there's no prohibition, there's no Torah prohibition on that. Now let's spend a few minutes examining what's the reason for this prohibition. Why does Torah say that we can't do it? Now, like any mitzvah, we keep it because God said so, but there's also a lot of insight and a lot of perspective into this. So perhaps we could say four things. Number one, our body is God's creation. By adding to it, we're sort of showing that it's like not perfect before I add it to it. By trying to change it and adding things, that's sort of a insult, so to speak, to the perfection of God's creation. We should consider our bodies perfect. That's the way God created it, and that's the way it should be. A second insight into this is that apparently in the olden days, it used to be a pagan custom to tattoo the name of their god. And since we try to not do anything that resembles idol worship, this would go into that. A very interesting insight that I saw, a third explanation, is that of course, every Jewish male has a bris, which also involves cutting the flesh. And by cutting another part of our body, we're sort of showing that the bris is not enough. That's not a good enough covenant, and we want to cut more parts of our body. We want to consider the one covenant that we have, the bris, the one place that Torah actually tells us to cut ourselves as holy and sacred, and in no other place shall we do that. And perhaps the most important point over here is as follows. Our bodies don't belong to us. We cannot do whatever we want to our bodies. Our bodies belong to God. In fact, in many Svarim, it describes the body as like a loan given to us, and we have to return it as whole as we can. Now, obviously, if something happens to the body, that's God doing it. But we can't intentionally damage or change or do anything to our body for no reason, because then we are returning an object which we have borrowed from God incomplete or damaged. And therefore, we have to realize that our bodies are holy, our bodies are sacred, and our bodies actually don't belong to us to do with it what we want. We're not allowed to wound ourselves unnecessarily, and for the same reason, it is prohibited to get a tattoo. Have a wonderful day.